vaccination numbers are increasing. Minnesota.
Good morning.
Good morning. What's up?
Well, I still have a sick puppy.
Oh no.
So,
just not keeping anything down?
well, I took her to the vet.
Yeah.
She might have an obstruction.
Yeah.
We're not sure, but
in which case she has to pass it or
well, throw it up, pass it, or surgery.
Surgery, yeah.
And
oh, Hannah.
She's looking like yeah, it wasn't super conclusive if it was impacted or if it was just
right.
You know, for all I know, she swallowed a whole scarf. I don't know. But yeah. So after this, I think I'm calling the urgent vet clinic.
Oh no. She's just not really moving much, huh?
Well, you know, she's not eating.
Yeah.
And it's chicken and rice. So, you know.
It's clearly something that she wants.
Yeah. So she ate a little bit this
Poor
morning
girl.
and yeah. Well, you would hope she would learn that don't pick up stuff off the, you know, but she won't.
She's a dog. She's
yeah.
It's hard. It's tough.
So, you know, dropped $350 yesterday.
Yeah, it's
who knows how much. It's 140 just to walk in the door at the urgent care clinic. So
yeah. Hi, Delzy.
Good morning, Delzy.
Good morning.
Hey, listen, I was going to ask Penny if I could come to your meeting for
the Lenten study. Yeah. Great.
Since I don't have anybody.
Well, let's see. It's not started yet. So we're still going to try to plug it. We're going to plug it today too, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we're going to plug it today. And I've been mentioning it to people, like people will like text me. Some people will email me and say they can't make it on Sunday for this reason or that. And then I'll say, are you going to do the book?
We're giving you lots of options. We're giving you lots of options.
Most people are that I've talked to so far, but I think Ann Wolf might have a number of people on Monday morning.
Good.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I talked to her yesterday.
This is the other
one.
This is the
What do you mean the other one?
This is the one I just picked up.
Yeah, I know.
Holding on to hope and touching to
okay.
Yeah. This is, do you know Michael Curry? He was the one that did so he's the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, but he did the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
Yeah. Okay.
But
right.
I heard him speak. Him speak at what was it?
Yeah, white Christian nationalism. He was on that panel.
Yes.
Yeah. He's really good.
And it was like,
well, I'm finishing this book today.
Oh, you got Malcolm X. Yeah.
Boy, that's a good book.
Isn't that such a well-written book? Oh my gosh. I read, when did I read that? Probably in high school. I need to go back to it though. It was like, that'll turn your stomach and your heart in a lot of different ways.
And my other book club read, well, the same one that's reading Malcolm X, the classic one. The Thursday night. Penny, what did we read that was so good?
You two are in so many book groups. I don't know how your husbands keep it straight.
Well, my husband reads all the time, so that's okay.
No, I know.
The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Pierce.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh my gosh. It
really
was.
I'll write that one down.
It has been probably the most impactful book to me.
Yeah.
In a way that I can't hardly describe in reading that book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's just.
You want to be mad at him, but then I want to just cry.
Yeah.
For this amazing person that just couldn't get out of it.
Yep.
So it's very good. And we're reading this one right now.
Yeah.
Do you want me to show you some of my library that's
I
spread
bet
out
you've
through-
got it. No, you've got a ton. I'm gonna let Andy Root. I'm gonna let this
Okay,
prestigious
in?
scholar in. Yeah.
That's
and
probably
I'm
good.
I'm curious to find out
Yeah.
what it is that people are having a hard time with.
Yeah, I started
The
it. I didn't think
prologue-
it was too bad.
Okay.
The prologue was rough,
Yeah.
but other than that, we've read things that are much harder to read.
Well, and someone told me there was a bad languages, but I haven't gotten that far yet. But if we Alexa,
There was?
if we read Sherman Alexie, there's bad language. So
I was gonna say, if
gotta
you
read
read
Sherman
stuff,
Alexie.
if you don't read stuff because of the language, I can respect that. But you also miss out on a lot of what real life is like.
True.
yes,
So
Yeah, that's
just
that's
because
been
we
a-
don't know anybody that says those
Hey,
words.
Andy. How goes it?
oh, really?
I don't.
Welcome.
Hello.
Oh, well, maybe I
This-
hang around more young adults than you. Yeah.
We're just talking books, right? We're
Yeah.
talking books and language. How many swear words do you include in your books, Andy? Quite a bit.
I would actually want to include more, but my editor
Your-
doesn't allow me to.
Your
so,
publisher and yeah. I think that's a constant battle.
yeah.
So here's a fun little deal. David and I were talking. I have a son who's 31 years old, and he had been living with us relatively recently, and now he's moved into a different place. And he came home and he was talking, and he wasn't around mom and dad, so his language was a bit different. And he goes, "Oh my gosh," he says, I've been swearing quite a bit. And I said, and I said to him, I said, I see that.
All right, hear that.
I hear that.
And it was one of these things where I said to him, I said, I was always told that people that use that kind of language don't
Don't know how to use language.
don't work at trying to expand their vocabulary.
Yeah.
And he's got a pretty big vocabulary. And he
Yeah.
goes, "Mom, that is not what I've heard." He says sometimes the more intellectual people will use some of the worst language.
Yeah,
We do not come
probably
to
a
a conclusion
false-
or consensus on that, but that was where the discussion went.
There's probably a false equivalency there of
I know, but it was just kind of funny how it went that
Yeah.
direction. And so Andy, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
I'm Penny, and I am the partner in crime with Pastor Peter as far as a lot of the organization of our adult forum stuff. And Delzy is also on the committee with us.
But I don't do anything.
So-
That's
Not-
the best
I send
membership
out
to have on
things
a
and I
committee.
go,
Oh,
Well, I can change
those are
that.
famous last words, Delzy. You've been now you're about to get, I'm gonna write that down. Write that down. She said she doesn't do anything. We need to equip you and empower you.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll empower her. What's the more? But we've had a couple of great sessions on Bonhoeffer so far, and so I'm really interested in hearing from a different person more about him. And that question, that we were left with is, who is Jesus Christ today?
It's true.
For us today?
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, so what does that question actually mean? What are we
Right.
talking about here? And then I'm like,
Yeah.
so we're talking about Jesus, but when does Jesus become Christ?
Yeah.
And what does that mean?
Yeah.
So
Penny has a lot of questions. That's why she's in charge. That's why
Very
we let her
nice.
run with things, but we're
Good morning,
really
Pat.
excited. Good
Morning.
morning, Pat.
He's
Where's
here.
John? Oh, there he is.
Oh, there he
Oh,
is.
John, I have to
Just
go
outside
get
the
something
frame.
to show you.
And I'll do, just so you know, Andy, I'll do a little intro to you and then,
Okay,
and then you can kind of run with things, but
okay.
do you
And I
need,
was just going,
do
well,
you
go
need,
ahead.
do you need screen share? I did give you co-hosting privileges if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'll
share
share. I'll share a screen. I have some
Cool.
slides that I'll show, and I was just figuring I'd go about 25 minutes or so, and just
Perfect.
talk the last 10 years of his life.
Yeah.
And I'll do my best to do that in 20 minutes, and
I
then
know
we
it's
can have
not easy.
conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll see.
I think, yeah.
So-
The whole thing about we need a full semester. That's, I keep coming back now.
Yeah.
Delzy, what do you think? Maybe a full semester?
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Oh,
do
that would
too.
be kind of fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know everyone's gonna think I'm weird, but John will get this. Look what I have found, John.
I know what it is. I know what it's gonna be. I know.
Ah.
This
It's
is,
the family
you
side.
got the families. This is, so with distance, with church being online, lots of people are experimenting with their choices of bread and wine. And Penny
I
is
see.
using, Penny has chosen graham crackers. So
Green crackers.
I see.
I've
Yeah,
been using bran
and
muffins.
talk about theology in a secular age.
yeah, right. Yeah,
It breaks really well,
It
you know, when you
breaks
break
super
bread. you get
well.
those
there you
nice
go.
little-
Yeah.
It's a little bit
And if
like
you
a
use
wafer, but
coffee as your
tastes way
wine,
better.
it's okay.
Yeah,
There
and
you
you
go.
know, my non-alcoholic is my coffee, which they could have had at the table as well. So
There's some coffee.
If they
Is
had coffee when Jesus was going around, he would have had it.
that true?
And
Did
Yeah.
they get it from the Ethiopians? Is that, when was that? I want to know. That's a good question, actually.
Penny?
I don't know.
Because
Yeah.
I thought coffee was discovered, it's the dancing goat, the dancing goats, right? That were eating coffee beans in Ethiopia. I thought that was the oral tradition story.
I don't know.
But you've got the Ethiopian eunuch, so clearly there's definitely some overlap.
There you go.
I don't know. That could be my next book. I'd like
There you go.
1300
Did
AD.
Jesus drink coffee?
Penny, that in the Christian spirit, in family size, you have to share.
That's
I
right.
do.
That's
Share.
right.
I mean, with
That's
us,
true. That's a built-in
I
thing
do.
with graham crackers is you have
Oh,
to
are
share
you
them.
meaning I need to start sending these out to everyone who comes on Sunday morning?
Yes.
you handle it the way you want. You just need to
Yeah.
share. You need to
We
share.
could do our next love drop with some
Wouldn't
graham
wouldn't you guys be shocked if every one of you got a box of graham crackers?
I would be.
We just got like these little, I hope this isn't giving away too much, but we did get new little communion cups for Easter to give out to everybody, but they're like really fancy chalice ones that have like, because the other ones that we got were
Ooh.
impossible to open. So we're trying a new one for Easter that we'll
Oh.
give out to everybody.
Okay. I
I'm
know
very- Not graham crackers though. I'm sure that it's not a graham cracker in there.
someone thought that told me they thought they were little cups of jelly, so they never opened them.
Oh,
Oh, Delzy,
Okay,
you are
coffee
full
was
of-
not
You are
invented
full of
until
things that
1300 AD.
1380,
1300 AD. So Jesus did not have a chance to drink coffee.
according to whom?
Well, they would have
Wikipedia.
had something.
Wikipedia says that.
Yep.
Okay, you are full of information today, Delzy. I'm gonna write down.
I don't know. This group is a little squirrelier this morning than usual. I'm liking it.
Hey, neighbor.
I'm gonna write down that.
Good morning, everyone. So glad everyone's come today. I know there's people wanting to go to the
Good morning.
drive-in this morning, so the chances of them getting back on time are probably pretty slim, but I'm hoping that they're not afraid to pop in if they come late.
Mr.
And Andy, we
Bosmo,
usually give them a few minutes.
We went to the
drive-in and had plenty of time.
we went to the drive-in.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
you worship outside today?
I went to the drive-in and I'm back.
Good job. I love it. You guys
We
are
had, we had,
Party.
Good
thir-
for you.
we had 17 cars.
nice.
Pastor,
17 cars.
Pastor Chris doesn't talk as long as Pastor Peter.
What?
I
That
said
seems
your-
strange.
your
She's the one who can
sermons are-
out-talk the best of us.
Your sermons are little longer than Pastor Chris's are.
Are you timing me, John?
Maybe she shortened,
In my
maybe
mind,
she shortened it.
Maybe mine are just more laborious for your mind. It
You
might
have
even
so
be
much-
that.
you have so much to offer that
Oh, yeah. Just
I
give it.
listen,
Yep.
I listen intently.
Mostly, I
just-
think you've heard my stories more than once, though, too. You're the one. Yeah. You want.
Well,
It gives new meaning to I'm back.
I'm back. Yeah. Love it. You're funny.
Well, before we get started, I just want to put in a plug for a few things. First of all, if you haven't had a chance to take part on Wednesday night, that was a really fun Lenten service. I don't know if you want, it was very interactive. It was great. And there was the possibility of some intergenerational things even happening there, which was really, really fun. So, and it also, the format that it is, there are people sharing their God stories, really, which is what our next session is going to be about. So you can kind of get a feel for it. And I challenge you to continue to come for that because Pastor Chris and Pastor Peter and Zanny are all going to really provide some new things for us to look at and how we can look at what it means to have a God story or God stories. Delzy, I didn't tell you, but you've been referenced. You and Joni were referenced in my little to-do in the Trinity today.
Oh,
So
really?
if you haven't read it, you're in there.
Oh, good. Okay. I hope it's good.
Get out your, what's the Tai Chi? What's the Tai Chi?
It is.
Canes?
Secondly, we are doing a book study for Lent. And the book is The Color of Law. And there's a number of different options. I don't know if it put out that discussions might be 3 weeks or not. And that's going to be kind of dependent on the leader as far as how they want to do it and how the group wants to do it. So if you haven't had a chance to get it, but would like to be a part of it, don't worry if you haven't, read any of it yet or anything. It's an exceptionally good book as far as learning about the history of how our governance has affected housing and how that has all affected poverty and discrimination within our country. And it's just an excellent book, excellent book. And so I encourage you to check that out. You can check down at Valley Bookseller. They had some copies still, and just tell them that you're part of the Trinity Church's book read, and they'll give you 15% off the book. And there's a place to sign up online. You got a number of different options of times and whatnot. And if things don't work, if you have questions about what's going on with it, feel free to get in touch with me or Pastor Peter or anyone else that's listed there on the thing. But really encourage you to check it out. It's just superb. I learned so much from this.
What's the author's
So
Richard
the author's
Rothstein.
name is Richard Rothstein.
Now, what's his background?
He is
He's a
a
professor.
fellow
Yep.
of Economic Policy and Institute and an Emeritus Senior Fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And he is a Senior Fellow at Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. There's a picture of him right there. Whoops.
Elsie will give you 50% off.
I
So
might.
If you need
This
50,
much of the book
we'll get you 50.
this much of the book is just references.
Yeah, it's
So
a
if you
really
want to
well
know if
researched.
someone, yeah, it's not an opinion piece. It's a very heavily researched book on the history within our country. So
and just how much housing
So it's-
intersects intersects people's lived experience. How central home is to every single one of us, every part of, yeah, I would say both human and otherwise. But how important that is.
Yeah, development of wealth and things that I thought everybody got to do. I'm like, oh, that wasn't right. Oh, so anyway, those are my 2 plugs, and I will let Pastor Peter take over in introducing our fabulous guest today, Andy Root.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for continuing to join us in this exploration and application of the life, the ministry, the mission, the discipleship of the Reverend Dr. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We've had a really good conversation so far. And today, Dr. Andy Root is with us. We had Dr. Lori Brandt Hale from Augsburg. Now we got Dr. Andy Root from Luther Seminary. Really excited. And Dr. Root is a leading thinker and theologian of practical, pastoral, and youth ministry, with particular focuses on Charles Taylor and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Paul Tillich too, right? Little bit. I feel like I've had you in class sometimes that talking about Tillich too. But I was really inspired by Andy's book called Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry, which is really references a lot of Bonhoeffer and some of his approach to ministry. I don't think I have it close by here, but he's speaks at the intersections of faith formation and also the secular age too. But we're really excited to have you, Dr. Root, and to pick up the story in these latter years of Bonhoeffer's unfortunately too short life, and how we can continue to live and learn through his witness. So take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me here and for being here. So this is the plan, is I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to fill in for you the last 10 years of Bonhoeffer's life. And we'll see how far we go within that. But I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you and changing my camera angle. And then I'm just going to jump right into his last 10 years. So we're going to pick up in 1935. And I don't know how far you've gone in your other discussions and things like that, but I'm just gonna, where you need me to fill in later, and you're like, how did we get from this to that? I can definitely do that. So picking up in 1935, actually in 35, Dietrich is pastoring a church in London. He ends up into London during the church conflict as the kind of confessing church is starting to bubble up. He leaves Germany and goes to London and takes over a German-speaking church in London for a while. Well, what happens while he's gone is the Pastors Emergency League that had kind of gathered these pastors and these congregations because they realized Hitler was pushing in too far into the church. They evolved and turned into what we call now the Confessing Church. And the Barmen Declaration, I don't know if you know much about that, but that was written at this time, which led to kind of a schism within German Protestantism. And it led to this group called the Confessing Church. Well, one of the big issues once this happened, once you have a confessing church and part of the church has split off from the state church and the state church has been overtaken by Hitler, is you have to figure, what are you going to do for pastors? And particularly, how are you going to train pastors? You can't really trust the universities anymore. And if you remember your history, every university professor in Nazi Germany had to give an oath to Hitler and had to lead the Hail Hitler ritual in the Hail Hitler before every class. So you cannot really have your future pastors being trained in the university system. So the Confessing Church created 5 illegal seminaries that would train pastors for these confessing churches. Now, Dietrich is in his late 20s, and he gets a letter that asks him if he would become the principal, the president of one of these illegal seminaries. Now, his grandmother had just given him a good amount of money, or said that she would support him if he would go to India and study with Gandhi, that he could actually learn Gandhi's non-resistant violence. And so he was about to do that. He had interchanged some letters with Gandhi's people to set up a possibility to go there. But then this opportunity came to go to Finkenwalde, one of these illegal seminaries, and he goes. And so when we pick up in this period in Finkenwalde, I don't want to go too far into this because there's whole books written about this, but it was a group of about 30 seminarians in a little schoolhouse that they had taken over, and it became very formative. Dietrich was in charge. He wasn't much older than the students who were there, and he led them not only in deep academic work, but a deep life of prayer. And they used a lot of monastic practices, a lot of spiritual practices of meditation and confession. And his good Lutheran German students at the beginning were not too keen on this. And they actually thought their good young teacher had gone the way of the Catholics and decided that they weren't going to do this confession of sin to each other, and they weren't going to meditate on one verse of scripture. And then Dietrich became very clear with them that this was not an option. If you were going to stay and be ordained, that you would have to do this. And part of the reason is that Dietrich knew that this was a pretty devastating reality was about to confront them, and that these pastors would not only need to be able to preach good sermons, but it was very possible they could have a gun to their head. And could they confess the faith in the midst of that? And just academic learning would not be enough, but they would have to learn to pray and really trust God in the midst of this. So this is the kind of ethos of Finkenwalde. It's also a place of pretty good fun. They listen to stay up late, drinking wine, playing the piano, listening to the spirituals, the slave spirituals that Dietrich had gotten in New York City. They would listen to these and talk about what this was like, and think about even the African-American experience in America, and think about who is Jesus Christ for us in the midst of that kind of experience, in the midst of our experience today up against war. They play a lot of soccer and do things like that. One of the interesting people that Dietrich meets at this time is in the car you see behind the wheel. This is Eberhard Bethge. And basically we know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is because of Eberhard Bethge, who they meet at this time. He will become from this point on Dietrich's closest friend, and all Dietrich's materials, all of the things that he's written outside of the Cost of Discipleship, in Life Together, in his doctoral dissertation, all the other material we have about Dietrich, for instance, all the letters that make up Papers and Letters from Prison, come from Eberhard Bethge. Most of the letters were written to Eberhard Bethge. And basically, I mean, we can get into this if you'd like, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer really wasn't known in the English-speaking world until the mid-1960s, and really until Eberhard Bethge got Dietrich's work out. I mean, in Germany, in some circles, he was known, but particularly in England and in the United States, he really wasn't known until the 1960s. And if it wasn't for Bethge, we just wouldn't know much about him at all. So that's a really important piece. During this time, there's also someone else in these confessing churches. You have to remember, it's much more like an American congregational situation, where they become dependent on the giving and stewardship of people within the congregation, which these were not state churches getting any more tax dollars. So they were really dependent on lay people supporting the work of these confessing churches. And one of the most influential people for Dietrich particularly was this woman here that you see in this picture named Ruth Kleister Ritzvau. And she funded a lot of the seminary. She funded a great deal of it, and she became a major confidant of Dietrich's. And as you're going to hear as the story goes here, Dietrich will spend a lot of time at her house too, at her estate. And she's an interesting person. And sounding like your book study is similar to this. She's a kind of layperson who read everything, and she loved Dietrich's books. She read Karl Barth's books, and she was really just a layperson who was really into theology. And as I'm going to tell you here in a second, she had Dietrich take her own grandchildren through confirmation, which would be a kind of cool thing to have to say your confirmation teacher was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bethge actually says in his biography that he's pretty sure that Ruth just did it because she wanted to sit through the lessons. Like, she pushed Dietrich to do this because she wanted to be part of the confirmation classes. But she becomes a really important person. Now, what happens is they spend a lot of these nights at the seminary talking about where they've been and what's the future. But one of the things they review is travel. And if you know Dietrich's story, up until 1935, he travels quite a bit. And he spends time in Barcelona. He spends time in New York City. While he's in the States, he ends in Havana. He spends a Christmas in Havana. Right before he goes back to Germany in 1931, he goes all the way down through Texas, through the Midwest, down to Texas, into Mexico. He loves to travel. He was going to go to India, wasn't able to, gets all around Europe. He loved traveling. So he was talking to his students about travel, and a lot of these students had never been out of Germany. So Dietrich's 30th birthday was coming. And they decided, you know what we should do, Dietrich, for your 30th birthday is we should go on a trip. We should go on a class trip. So they decided that they would. Finkenwald is kind of the northern part of Germany. So they decided that they would get on a ferry and they would go to Sweden for a trip. Well, what happens when they go to Sweden is that they get there and the bishop of the Swedish church comes out to where these students are coming in on the ferry and greets them. And it becomes front page news in the Stockholm newspaper. Now, at first blush, you're like, what's the big deal about this? But remember, this is an illegal seminary. Sweden in the shadow of the National Socialists who are eating up Europe, or the war seems like is right on the cusp here. And the bishop happens to go and welcome the illegal seminary people in. So it becomes front page paper. Up until 1937, the Gestapo and really the National Socialists didn't really care about these illegal seminaries. They were small. They had other things to worry about. But now that it became front page news, it was on the radar. And within a year, the seminary would be closed. So in 1937, the SS would come and close it. So Dietrich tried to keep this education going by almost like Pauline epistles, writing circular letters. So he would write letters, send them around, because all the young men in the pastorates got kind of sent to these congregations and were embedded in these congregations. So he tried to do that. He spent time at Ruth's estate trying to keep this seminary going, though now at a distance. It's a little bit like having to do church on Zoom, I suppose, is what he was trying to do here. And he was catechizing Ruth's grandkids. Here's a picture of his grandkids. The oldest one is a young woman named Maria von Wedemeyer, which, hold on to that name because she will come back in our story here in a second. But if you want a really captivating and quite shocking and beautiful sermon, is that Dietrich preaches their confirmation sermon. And it's on Mark 9, the text of Mark 9. And it is really still quite captivating and relevant. And sometimes I think pastors should just preach this sermon on Confirmation Sunday, because we're here right on the cusp here of 1937 into 38. And it really does appear that war is going to be coming. And Dietrich preaches this very somber sermon. And he takes the Mark 9 text where the Father says, "I believe, help my unbelief." And he tells these young kids that the confirmation rite is important, and it is needed, and it is a beautiful thing. But don't confuse what it means to confess the faith. That we don't confess the faith in the confirmation service. We only confess the faith out in the world, and that there may be some really dark days ahead of them. And then he defines faith for them, and he says that faith is always weak. That you can never have strong faith. That faith is always like the Father in Mark 9, "I believe, help my unbelief." That faith is always a pleading for God in the midst of fear and in doubt. That it is always a weak faith. And in some sense, it's always weak on the receiver's end because it is always gift. Now, we could get into this more if you'd like to, but then he draws this incredible parallel between what he calls banked faith and manna, faith as manna. And he wants to say that faith itself cannot be banked. You can't bank faith. You can only have enough faith, like the Israelites with the manna, enough faith for the day. And he's saying to these confirmands that what they're being confirmed into, which we too often, I think in our own confirmation programs, and even sometimes our own youth ministries, is that we think what they're for and what we fund them for and why we get a good youth director, so we can bank faith in people. And this is what Christian education is about too. We bank faith in people, so when they come on hard times, they can live off the interest of that. And Dietrich is actually saying it's quite different than that. If you try to bank faith, even with really great programming, it will rot. It will actually rot. The only way to have faith is to receive it every day anew. And yes, you can teach practices to know how to receive that faith every day anew, but you can really only receive it every day anew. There's a great humility that Dietrich is seeing on what faith is. That faith is this humble seeking for the living Jesus Christ every day, and often through our weakness, in our brokenness, in our pleas for God up against our deepest questions. So this becomes what Dietrich is really thinking about during this period. And it leads us then into the Great Transition as we enter into 1938 and 39, where Dietrich is now in between years here. And he he eventually is kicked out of Berlin. He's not allowed to be in Berlin. He's not allowed to write anything. He can only go to Berlin to stay at his parents' house, is the only time that he can go there. And he's got a pretty big issue here, because as 1938 starts to dawn and war becomes clear, in 35, 34-ish, he makes a strong confession that he's a pacifist, that he thinks that war is outside of God's will. And so he's asked, even at that time, by a teenager, he's asked, what will he do if he's called to fight? And he says, I pray that I will be able to resist. Well, as you can imagine, in Nazi Germany, conscientious objection is not an option. If you refuse to fight, it is only death. So Dietrich has this pretty big issue, is that what is he going to do? Because his age group is going to come up pretty quickly as they start to draft people into the military. And he's not sure how he's going to deal with this. So as he enters into this period in 1938, something else happens to the family that really galvanizes them towards resistance. And this is a picture of Dietrich when he's young, and that is his sister Sabine. And I don't know if you've talked about this yet, but I really think a key to understanding Dietrich Bonhoeffer, both his life story as well as his theology, is to know that he's a twin, that this is his twin sister Sabine. And so Dietrich's theology is really deeply about shared life and communion and what it means to really be with and for each other. And he had that experience as a twin, that kind of unique experience of being connected to a sibling. Well, his sister Sabine marries a man, probably in the 1920s, marries a man named Liebholz, Gerhard Liebholz, who happens to be a Christian, but his mother's Jewish, and he's a lawyer and a law professor. He loses his law position pretty early on after 1936, 37, when the Nazis start taking over. And in 1938, it is looking bleak. And they start to realize that they are in deep danger. The Bonhoeffer family is pretty quickly into resisting the National Socialists because of these family experiences. I mean, there's other reasons as well, but the fact that Gert, as they call them, was so closely connected to the family, and the oppression that he was going under made them very aware that there was something very rotten at the center of the National Socialists. So what happens is in 1938, they have to escape. They have to leave. And so Dietrich's sister Sabine and her two children and her husband escape to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland get into England. Now, to Dietrich's great, I think, the great honor, he felt very honored by this. He was able to have his connections in the UK. He was able to make a way for her in England. He knew the bishop, one of the bishops there, and the bishop was able to get her a spot, but she had to leave without anyone knowing. And her two kids tell the story after the war in a documentary series about how their mother woke them up. And they were probably under 10, woke them up, put 2 jackets on them, 3 pairs of socks, a couple pairs of pants, and then told the children that they were just going to the store, that they were going to go to the market for a few hours. Could not tell the children that they were going to leave the house and never come back. Couldn't pack anything up because that would be suspicious. So the children had as many clothes as they could put on them, and they left. And the house was left as if they would be back at noon. Of course, they would never return to that house. Dietrich actually writes one of his most important books, most famous books, Life Together, which was an analysis and a thinking about what it was like at Finkenwalde. He writes that with Bethke in his sister's empty house. Her sister's empty house haunted as if she's going to return in a few hours. The butter's still on the counter, but she will never be returning. But as Dietrich makes a way to get his sister over there, he's able to get back and forth to England a few times. And while he's there, there's an American theologian, I don't know if you know his name, Reinhold Niebuhr. He was in the news actually of late, died in the 60s, but was in the news because Barack Obama started reading him about 10 years ago and said his favorite theologian was Reinhold Niebuhr. And so Reinhold Niebuhr, Dietrich was about a generation older than Dietrich and was at Union Theological Seminary as a professor when Dietrich was there as a fellow. And so Niebuhr was actually in Scotland because he was preparing these very famous lectures that still go on now. They're called the Gifford Lectures that are at one university in Scotland. They moved from Aberdeen to Edinburgh to St. Andrews, and they move every year. And Niebuhr was there to give those lectures. And so Dietrich went to see him because he knew him from his student days. And as they talked, Dietrich shared with Niebuhr his issue that, you know, he was not going to fight, that he was known as someone who was resisting the government, and yet his age was going to come up. And Niebuhr said, you know what? I think I can get you out. I think there's a way we can get you out. So Niebuhr sent telegrams back and forth from America, and he made a way for Dietrich to teach summer school, that he would go to Union, he would go to New York City and teach summer school. And then Dietrich's very good friend, the American Paul Lehman, I don't know if you talked about him at all, who plays an important piece in Dietrich's story. Niebuhr told Lehman to go and to set up a lecture tour basically across the states for a year. So Dietrich would go to all the colleges and seminaries, and surely after all those speaking engagements, some school would give him a professorship for the remainder of the war, and Dietrich would be safe. That was the plan. And Dietrich said, that's great, let's do it. So he gets on a boat and heads to America, and he makes it all the way to New York City. And in many ways, that's how our story should end. Our story should end with Dietrich made it to New York City in 1939, summer of 1939. And that was it. He survived the war. He maybe taught at a seminary that the pastor you grew up with went to, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave your pastor a very bad grade because I don't know if you talked at all about Dietrich's personality, but is a very commendable person, but was also a very arrogant person in his own right. He even said this, that his biggest spiritual issue is he had to always pray about his own arrogance. He was always sure he was the smartest person in the room. So you could imagine that if he taught your class or your pastor's class in the 1970s or something, he probably gave him a D+ for his sermon. But that's not, of course, what happens. That Dietrich ends up in New York City. He's safe. He finds his way to Union. And still at Union, if you go to Union Theological Seminary, there's a room that's called the Prophet's Chamber, which is fairly ironic. And at the time, it was kind of guest housing. Now it's a conference room. You can meet and there's a table and chairs in it. But before it was a bedroom, and there was a sink, and that's where Dietrich stayed for these weeks. And he, as soon as he got into New York City, he had this incredible wave of regret. And he thought, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. And he was only here for a few weeks. And they said after they cleaned out their prophet's chamber after he left, that what they found was just stacks and stacks of crinkled up paper with German words written on them, and loads of cigarette butts. That Dietrich spent most of his time pacing in that room, smoking and thinking about everyone he had left back in Germany, praying and regretting that maybe he shouldn't be here. Finally, he feels like he can't be here, that this isn't right. So after just a few short weeks, he sends word back to Niebuhr in Scotland that says, Professor Niebuhr, I'm very sorry, but I cannot stay. Niebuhr telegraphs back and says, no, Dietrich, you can stay. No, I can't. And he has these two very strong and powerful words where he says, don't you understand, Professor Niebuhr? If I don't suffer through this moment with my country, if I don't suffer through this moment with Germany, I'll have no right to participate in the rebuilding of Germany. I cannot sit this out. And then he said this incredibly powerful either or. He said, don't you understand, Professor Niebuhr, that the German people stand under a great either or. They can either will the victory of their nation and therefore the end of Christianity on the continent of Europe, or they can will the defeat of their nation and therefore the continuation of Christianity. Professor Niebuhr, I can't sit this out. I have to go back. So he made arrangements to get back on a liner and head back to Europe, getting there just before the war would start. Well, of course, Paul Lehman, who had set up all these speaking engagements for the next 8 months, is living in St. Louis. And he gets another word from Niebuhr and says, Bonhoeffer is thinking about going back, get to New York City. So he has to jump in his car in St. Louis and drive overnight to get to New York City to try to talk Dietrich off of returning. Gets there just in time. They have a nice conversation, but there's no persuading Bonhoeffer to stay, that he's leaving. He embraces his friend. Lehman watches him go up onto the ship deck and wave to him, and he says that he has this sinking feeling that he'll never see his friend again. And sure enough, he never will. So Dietrich heads back in the fall of 1939, but he still has this problem. And the problem is he won't serve in the military, but he can't really be in Germany unless he does. Well, this is Dietrich's brother-in-law, Hans von Dahani. I don't know if you talked about Dahani as much, but if you go to the Resistance Museum today in Berlin, Dahani has way more pub than Dietrich Bonhoeffer does. In many ways, in kind of secular conversations about resistance, Dahani is a hero, and there are streets named after Dahani, and Dahani marries Dietrich's second sister, his second oldest sister, Christina, is who he marries. And Dietrich has known him since he was an adolescent. He's been in and out of the house, and is very, very close to him. Well, Dahani is the secretary, one of the high-ranking secretaries in the Abwehr, which is essentially like our CIA. It is the kind of intelligence agency. And he says to Dietrich, you know what, we're running spies. That's what we do. We run spies. And I think I can get you, I think I can, with your connections, ecumenical connections, I think I can get you signed off to be a spy. So Dietrich takes it, because what Dietrich knows is not only are they running spies, but what's happened with the Abwehr is the whole Abwehr office has flipped. And they are now in the process of trying to bring forth a coup d'etat. So Dietrich will be a spy, but that will be, in his ecumenical contacts, will be a cover, but that these are double agent spies. So Dietrich enters into being this double agent spy, which seems very Hollywood, but for poor Dietrich, it's not all that exciting. It's a lot of time sitting alone in monasteries in Munich and writing letters to his mother to do his laundry for him. He still is not married, and you know, back and forth to the room he keeps at his parents' house. But there was some really profound things he did as well. I mean, Dietrich did help with Hans von Dahani get 7 Jews out of Germany, and he was bringing secrets. His main job was to get to his English connections, and Bishop Bell was someone he was very close to, and Bishop Bell was connected to Churchill. And what the Abwehr really needed to know is that if they could bring forth a coup d'etat, if they could get Hitler and move Hitler off, would the Allies stop bombing? And the only way they could get word from that was through Bell to Churchill. So Bell told Churchill that there was this group in Germany that was thinking of a coup d'etat. Would they have the time to get a new government in place before while the bombing was stopped? The word is, I don't have complete documentation on this, but Churchill said, no way. The bombing will continue. We are not going to negotiate this. But that was really Dietrich's main move. The government, Hitler's government, thought he was stealing secrets from the English. He was actually giving them secrets. And that was really what Dietrich was after. And this whole office is in the middle of trying to bring forth this coup d'etat. So this brings us then into the 1943 period, which all this is happening. Dietrich is smuggling, allowing 7 Jews to get out of Germany. He's trying to get these secrets back and forth. The coup d'etat is starting to take shape. And Dahani is keeping what he calls his poison cupboard. Dahani, for about 10 years before this, has been documenting all the Nazis' atrocities and hiding them. So this whole office has been really opposed to the government for a long time. Well, what of course occurs is there becomes hearsay. There becomes some suspicion that Dietrich and Hans have been involved in illegal things. And in Nazi Germany, you don't need proof. You just need a hunch, and you can do what you need to do. So in 43, Dietrich, a black limousine shows up to his parents' house, and he's arrested. And at the same time that he's arrested, just across a town a few blocks away, Hans is arrested as well. So Dietrich and Hans are arrested. Dietrich is sent to the Togel prison, and there he will stay for a few years. Now, they don't have really anything on Dietrich. They don't have much of anything on him. But you don't need anything. So he's being held, and every day he is being interrogated. And his biggest anxiety right now is that he cannot say anything that would implicate Hans, or even more importantly, would reveal anything about the coup d'etat that was in place. And if you read Papers and Letters from prison, you'll have this feeling from reading it, the first half of it particularly. Letters that go to Becca, letters that go to his fiancée, who I'm going to tell you about here in a second, letters that go to his parents, that they're very upbeat. Dietrich particularly tells his fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer, who was in his confirmation class. This is Ruth's granddaughter. It's really creepy, actually, because she's 19 and Dietrich's in his 30s. I mean, I think this was more common in the early part of the 20th century, but now it just seems a little weird. And I tell pastors all the time, you know, don't ever date anyone who's in your confirmation class. That's just, stay away from that. That's a boundary violation. But she was in his confirmation class at 19. They become engaged right before Dietrich goes into prison, and they a lot of letters go back and forth. And she goes and visits him, and they're very upbeat about their engagement and about getting married. And Dietrich's very upbeat to his parents, very upbeat to Eberhard, that they don't have anything on him, and the coup d'etat is going to happen. There's real confidence that this is going to occur. And if you read the first half of Papers and Letters, you get this sense. But Dietrich has to be very careful that he doesn't say anything. Well, has a lot of freedom in this Toggle prison, and as months go on and years go on, he gets more and more freedom to write, freedom to send letters. I mean, it all goes through a censor and things like that. So even with the family, books are passed back and forth, and they create a coded way to send messages through the books. Like they underline letters, and they do it kind of in a reverse manner. So they have to be careful, but Dietrich is allowed to send letters, and he's allowed to get books and things like that. Well, one of the first essays he writes an essay called "What Does It Mean to Tell the Truth?" Now imagine you're in prison, and every day your interrogator comes to you and wants to know things, and you have to lie flat out to this person. Particularly to keep your brother-in-law alive, you have to lie. And he writes this very fascinating essay about what does it mean to tell the truth. And we can get into this if you'd like with our discussion time, but it's fascinating because Dietrich uses what he often does, is he uses the analogy of parents and children as an example of this. And he wants to say whatever it means to tell the truth is always based in the context of relationships. So he thinks about what does it mean for a parent to tell a truth to a child, or what is truth demanded of a child to a parent. And he has this beautiful quote where he says, truthfulness of the child toward a parent is in its very nature something different from that of parents towards their children. While the life of a small child lies open to the parents, and the child's world is to reveal all that is hidden in secret, the same cannot be true of the reverse relationship. And then he continues, in regards to truthfulness, therefore, the parents' claim on the child is something different from the child's claim on the parents. I mean, the way I often think about this is Bonhoeffer saying truth is always based inside of relationships, and you have to hold the truthfulness of the relationship itself. For instance, parents don't just disclose information to children. That's not truthfulness. So when a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old says, "Mommy, where do babies come from?" it is not truthful to say, well, what happens is mommy has too much wine, and then daddy starts to, rub mommy's neck. You can imagine, you don't say that to a 4 or 5 or 6 or an 8-year-old. My gosh, you don't even want to say it to an 18-year-old, or they'll vomit in your midst. There's a way that you talk about it that is actually truthful to the humanity of the young person themselves. And Dietrich is saying there's a similar situation here. The person he owes truth to is his brother-in-law in another prison who he's trying to keep alive. Who he owes truth to are the Jews who are being killed in concentration camps, and this coup d'etat that he has to hide through his disclosure of information is a truthfulness towards his commitment to his neighbor. It's a very complicated argument, but you can see what he's working out while he's in prison. Well, what happens, of course, is this coup d'etat takes place, it tries to take place. And if you want to see a film version of this coup d'etat, you can watch. There's a Tom Cruise movie called Valkyrie, and that is there's no reference of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in it, and it's Tom Cruise in a Nazi uniform running around Berlin, which is kind of interesting. But it's the historical story of this. And if you've seen that movie or read about the Valkyrie move, you know that what happened is that they were allowed to get into a room with the Fuhrer, and they put a bomb in a briefcase, and were allowed to get one person in there. This person found themselves sitting right next to the Fuhrer, put the bomb in the briefcase right next to the Fuhrer. But it was all based on speed. So as soon as the Fuhrer was dead, They knew they had to start and put a new government in place. If there was any delay, then Goring or someone would take over. So they immediately had to make a move. So they knew that the bomb would be placed. The person who put it would need to leave the room, get near a phone, and be able to call back to Berlin immediately to start this coup d'etat. We don't know exactly what happened, but the bomb went off. The Fuhrer was injured, but not killed. They started the mechanisms of the coup d'etat. The person called, said the Fuhrer is dead. Start the process. And of course, the Fuhrer was not dead. All those people that were involved in that were taken out and killed. And Dietrich knew at that moment in his prison cell that his last best hope was over. And if you read the second half of the Letters and Papers and from Prison, you have a very different Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He knows that his destiny is now sealed. They don't know he has any connection to it yet, but it's only a matter of time till they connect these dots, and he is not leaving this prison alive. He knows that. And it takes a very different tone on what it means for him to be there. Well, sure enough, eventually they do. Hans, after this happens, if you think about the kind of heroicism of Hans von Dahani, he starts poisoning himself. His wife smuggles in poison and he starts taking it, because the few laws that the Nazis will uphold, there is a law that that Hans can use that says any sick prisoner cannot be interrogated. So he keeps himself sick enough that he can't be interrogated. So you just think of this, and his wife has to smuggle this in, and she actually had a nervous breakdown after the war, and you can imagine why. So he's sick, and Dietrich knows that it's only a matter of time. Well, he continues to write. He continues to really think about who am I up against my death, and many important questions. Well, towards the very end of this, he's made friends with a prison guard named Knobloch. And Knobloch says that he goes to Dietrich's family and says, I'm willing to sneak Dietrich out. We can sneak Dietrich out. All I need is clothes. If you can give me some of his clothes, I can sneak him out. So they hide clothes in a basket on the other side of the Tagal prison, and they're going to sneak him out. As soon as it's dark, Dietrich will be snuck out and survive this. Well, the day before he's going to be snuck out that night, Dietrich's brother, Hans, and his brother-in-law, Rudiger Schleicher, are arrested. And Dietrich knows he can't go. If he escapes and they find out that he is gone, they will go immediately to his brother and his other brother-in-law and simply shoot them in the head. So he's stuck, and there's nowhere to go, which then leads us to Dietrich's fate being sealed. But eventually into 1945, chaos is occurring, bombing is happening all over Germany. But eventually Dietrich is taken out of his prison cell, and the documentation we have is he's taken to the basement of the SS. We know he's beaten fairly severely there. He's then put into the back of a pickup truck with other prisoners of war and other enemies of the state, and they're driven into the Bavarian forest. Eventually they get to the Flossenburg concentration camp. It's a work camp. And on this wall that you see right before you, Dietrich is taken to it, and he is hung and killed on this wall. In the back of that pickup truck, and then even into this working camp, was a man by the name of an Englishman, a parachuter who was captured, named Payne. And according to Payne, it feels a little bit too Hollywoodish, but I think it's probably true, is that Dietrich, before he left this building you see here and headed to that wall to be hung, said to Payne, "Tell my friend Bell what happened to me. And tell Bell that for me, this is the end. No, not the end, just the beginning." So Dietrich is killed on this wall, 39 years old. Dietrich is, the family has no idea what has happened to him. It's pure chaos in Berlin, and they have no sense of what's happened to him. Maria runs all over Berlin in the greater area to camps looking for Dietrich. They have no idea what's happened. As the Allies and as the Soviets find their way into Berlin and the National Socialists are arrested, the family starts listening again to the BBC. It was illegal to listen to the BBC, but they start listening to it. And one day they still don't have any idea where Dietrich is. He's lost, and they've lost everything. This is a family that really, from the early 20th century, nothing but good things had happened to them. And yet here in the 1945, they lose two sons, two of their three sons, and they lose two son-in-laws, all killed. Rudiger, Hans, they're all killed. And they still don't know what's happened to Dietrich. And then all of a sudden they're listening to the BBC and they hear over the BBC a service going on at the Westminster Abbey put on by Bishop Bell for their son, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And that's how they get confirmation that Dietrich is dead. And now the debate continues. Oh, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer a martyr for his faith? How do we think about Bonhoeffer? How do we think about Bonhoeffer, who when he entered into the conspiracy said that if it had to be that he would kill Hitler himself, which he was never asked to do this, a pacifist who did that. The final story before we have a little conversation is when Dietrich was working with his family in the conspiracy, they did have, and they were talking about what the conspiracy would mean. They decided is they would have to talk around their kitchen table of their parents' house, kind of in code, and they would call Hitler Uncle Charlie. And they said, well, the only way that things will change is if Uncle Charlie dies. That it will just not work to arrest him and put him in a prison cell. He will continue to have power even while he's there. He must die. And supposedly Dietrich pushed himself back from the kitchen table and said, listen, I'm a pastor. I cannot advocate in any way for anyone to be killed. That would be opposed to the 10 Commandments. And his sister, who was an agnostic atheist at best, Hans von Honey's wife, looked at him and said, oh, you Christians. Oh, you Christians would dance in the street tomorrow if you found out someone else got their hands dirty killing Hitler, but you won't do it yourself. And Dietrich knew at that moment that if he was called to acquire the guilt, that he would have to do it. Of course, he never was, but his life story kind of continues to leave those questions open. All right, so I'm going to stop. I think this gives us some time to talk. Maybe went on a little bit more than you wanted, but hopefully that gives you a taste of the end of his life.
Thank you, Andy. That was awesome. a lot to take in as usual. Anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself or type them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll go with any method at all there. Don't be shy. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is all in 1945, and actually, I think he died in, I don't know, April, am I right? I think he died in April, so it was really towards the end of the war. What would he say now is going on in the United States? I mean, you know, that's a historical time. We could say that's over with, that's never going to happen. I had my mother lived through German occupation, and it pretty much ruined her entire life. And I will tell you so I read a lot about Hitler and the Nazis and World War II because it was so important to my mom. And I have to ask, what is the Christian church supposed to do now?
Yeah. Because
I see so many similarities between now. Even you mentioned Hitler will continue to have power even if he's in prison. Yeah. Well, you know, Trump continues to have power. He's not in prison. I don't think he is anyhow. I have to tell you, my mother was French. She was not German. Okay, so I've always just amazed that could happen. And I see so many similarities. Even the fact that Trump was reading a lot of stuff by Hitler. My New Order was a big thing with him, which is a collection of Hitler speeches. And so, you know, historically that's over with, but we just lost. We just lost 5 people at the Capitol. Yeah, that's not a lot of people, but it could have been so much worse. What would Bonhoeffer say about Christians and Christian leadership in the United States now? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so let me just touch on the few things that come to mind, because what we really need is, you know, a 300, 400 page book really analyzing that, because there's so much there. I think there are similarities. I think there are legitimate similarities to the rhetoric that's used. I mean, one of the very interesting things that you'll see that the National Socialists use, and all kind of fascist movements tend to take, and we saw this in Germany, and Dietrich had a kind of front row seat of this, is that fascism, first of all, tends to paint every one of its enemies as socialists and speaks of socialism as a very bad word. And that's very interesting how that's happened in our perspective. And that happened with Dietrich. Dietrich was teaching confirmation, and the boys in this area called Wedding, the Wedding district of Berlin, these were confirmands. And Dietrich had his first real experience with the National Socialists when the brown shirts would come through this working class area, and any boy who was somewhat connected to the socialist movement, they would beat up terribly, and would basically turn them into scapegoats. But what Dietrich would say to us that we have to be very aware of, and there's so many parallels, there's also some really significant differences too that we have to be aware of, particularly how we think about how identity functions and how duty functions in those societies are different, I think, and how kind of consumerism has worked. But one of the elements that is really, I think that Dietrich would warn us about is how resentment plays within society. How this deep forms of resentment and colliding forms of resentment. So Dietrich gave a radio address in 35 or 34 called The Younger Generation's Altered Conception of the Führer. And he's really looking at how the younger generation has been kind of co-opted into or been susceptible to wanting a great leader, almost a celebrity leader to follow. And he says one of the main reasons is that what's been created, what this diabolical Führer does is create enemies everywhere, and it's us versus them, and they're the ones. It's those people who are keeping you from having the good life that you're supposed to have. And he would warn us that the Christian church has to somehow rise above these forms of resentment, because it works the other way too. And what we, I think, have in our society are these kind of reverberating resentments of, I mean, that's part of what our culture war is all about, is that we just feel like everyone that's on the other side is our enemy in the midst of this, and it kind of just reverberates back and forth. And Dietrich would wonder if the Christian story, and that kind of sermon even that I told you about of faith is the weak word, it's given as a gift, allows us to escape a little bit of that reverberation of this kind of sense of resentment or the enemy. And Dietrich was his favorite philosopher was actually Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche had this very wrong but captivating example of, he thought Christianity was embedded in what he called resentment, the French word resentment, this idea that your life isn't going so well and it's someone else that you need to blame for that. And this has just been kind of endemic within modernity, that we tend, it pops up from the soil a lot throughout the history of the last 300 years, where these forms of resentment come up. And remember, Hitler was able to come to power because he was able to galvanize people's resentment. The way that the French and the English at the Treaty of Versailles were basically so harsh in their in what they demanded for payback after World War I, that it just set Germany on this path of fascism. And there's a really great book by the thinker named Karl Polanyi, who wrote about this, and about how Versailles sets up this dynamic to lead all these people to feel this deep level of resentment and to try to get revenge. And that's what Hitler built on. And it's the same rhetoric we see with Trump, which is really scary, is that we need revenge. And we'll have to be very aware of this now, that he really feels like he needs revenge. And there's no wonder he never gave up on the election has been stolen from me, because part of his power is to say there are people out there, certain elites, who have taken things away from us, and we have to fight for it. And if we don't fight for it, we're never going to get it back. And that's the same kind of dynamic that that Bonhoeffer saw. But Bonhoeffer would be wary of us entering into the game then to fight. That we would actually have to take on different perspectives that actually can embrace neighbor and have a different way of sharing in each other's lives. So that's just a start to it. I mean, it's such a great question. I could ramble on forever on it.
Anyone else? Lene.
I'm curious about what the historians say
the impact that Churchill's decision was on Bonhoeffer's life, and to not, cease the bombing in order for that group to make its move seems, in hindsight, of course, the wrong decision. But I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not really sure how the historians have analyzed that, and I'm not sure the viability actually of that conspiracy taking hold. But it is very interesting, and I think there has been some negative comment. It's in some sense it's hard to have negative kind of views of what Churchill did, because he did save the British Isles, and the Allies did free the world from teetering on a very different kind of world. But it is very true that Churchill did not have patience for any kind of sense of mercy isn't the right word, but for anything other than full measure. He just felt like, and to his credit, he saw how devastating and how ambitious Hitler was, where even others in his government did not, and thought that they could negotiate with this man. And Churchill had a feeling very early on, after he became prime minister, that there was no negotiating, there was no third way with this guy. It was either our society or their society. And I think retrospectively, maybe there would have been a way forward. I think in some sense, Churchill could regret it, and some of you may know more about this, but there was a certain way that both Stalin and Roosevelt kind of cut Churchill out of the negotiations for what the world would look like post-war. Churchill did have this feeling that good old Roosevelt, who I actually love Roosevelt, but he kind of gave a nice little elbow to Churchill, knocking him out of there, because Roosevelt had particular problems with the English Empire and the way imperialism of the English Empire and colonization worked. And he didn't feel like that really jived with American senses of freedom. And so he was more willing to negotiate with Stalin for the peace and kind of leave the English out of it. And so maybe in retrospect, Churchill should have taken the coup d'etat government coming in place, because maybe it would have helped the British more later on. But that's hard to know, but yeah.
John.
What effect did the entry of the virus have to do on the president's plan for governance? Negative or positive?
Yeah, obviously with this administration.
Yeah.
So here's this is another longer conversation, and maybe Peter can set up a conversation for this another time. But it is very interesting. I mean, he mentioned my work with Charles Taylor, and Taylor talks about two different things. He talks about what he calls an age of mobilization, which was pretty much the way we lived from the revolution, the American Revolution, up and really till the 1960s, where what we were trying to do was mobilize realities. And even our capitalism was a kind of organized capitalism that worked on these kind of larger projects. And it was a mobilization of things. Well, since the late 1960s, we've entered into a time where we might call an age of authenticity, where what's really important is that each individual have a right to define for themselves what it means for them to be human. I think when you look at Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is an ultimate president of authenticity. And what I mean by that is, even at CPAC this last week, there was really very little talk about policy at all. There was really talk about culture war issues, about how people's own identities are against our identities. It's all about virtue signaling and things like that. I mean, particularly Ted Cruz's speech was all about that. How many masks are they going to make us wear? Blah, 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 blah. So Trump really was able to get the vote because the people who supported him, the 70 million, thought he was the most authentic person. And someone would say he's got terrible character, but at least he tells it like it is, and at least he's authentic. I don't completely agree with that, but that's what they would say. Well, when the virus comes in the pandemic, what becomes really, really clear is that he has stripped the government and has no imagination or really no interest in any kind of mobilization. of being able to mobilize any institutions to function. So all the talk is, well, let's forget about it and let's remember me and my personality and my identity. And then we get masks and see masks are an identity issue, not a scientific issue. And so what we're trying to do now is trying to recover from this, but the left is also susceptible to this deep authenticity move in its own right, but we're trying to get back to mobilizing. And it is interesting, you know, I mean, maybe this is an illusion, but there's a great big history book called 1942, and it's about how after Pearl Harbor, in like 36 days, the American government mobilized for war. Like, we're able to build just warcraft and mobilize people, and it took like 36 days from, you know, early December until mid-January to do this. And now you think about it, and it feels like even with all of our technology, we can't get this thing figured out. It seems impossible to kind of get this figured out. And maybe it's a little bit of an illusion, but it used to feel like in the mid 20th century, with all the bad things that happened, we could mobilize things. We could get things going. You could make things happen. And now we're really struggling with that. And we don't really know how to even talk about it. So I think the virus undercut him completely, because he lost some people who would have supported him for identity purposes, who just realized we need to get out of this virus, and this guy cannot lead the institutional structures to do that. But that's a larger issue of how we even think about politics now. Is politics about mobilizing ways of life, or is it about identity? And that's a big question, I think. And it is something that Dietrich really didn't have to deal with as much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, John, as in John.
I have a question relative to, did Hitler get to know Bonhoeffer personally, or was it only through his deputies that he heard about Hitler?
It's very possible that
Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, it's very possible that Hitler never even knew the name Bonhoeffer. Now, that being said, the Bonhoeffer name was well known in Berlin. Because it's possible, actually, if Hitler knew any Bonhoeffer, he knew Dietrich's father, because Dietrich's father was the chair of psychiatry at the University of Berlin. And one of the very interesting historical points is, remember that Hitler is able to take the presidency and chancellorship under himself and become the Führer because, well, what we said earlier, they burned on the Reichstag. Who do they blame it on? The socialists. And they pin it on one socialist young man, and they say he's the one who burned down the Reichstag, the terrorist attack that leads Hitler to have complete power. It's fascinating that the person who does the psychological review on this young man is Karl Bonhoeffer. So it's possible that Hitler knew Karl Bonhoeffer because he knew he did that psychological review, or knew he was a university professor. Dietrich, he probably never knew. He would have maybe heard of Hans von Dahani, but would not have known of Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself. And so it is interesting to think about, because the Bonhoeffers they're very early on resisting Hitler. But part of it is that the Bonhoeffers do have a sense of being the elite of Berlin. They are the true elites of Berlin. And now these people from Munich are coming up, and Hitler is no intellectual. These are thugs. And so part of the Bonhoeffer resistance is the legitimate experience of watching what's happening to Jews, of being connected to the government and seeing laws being broken. But there is also a kind of level of being elites as well that plays within it, which is another very interesting thing for us to think about, because a big move of Trump and Trump's following is to attack elites and to say that, see, it's the elites that have failed you, and we cannot trust the elites. People who tell you which way you need to talk, people who are from universities, you can't trust these people. And there just is an interesting conversation within a society like ours, where our elite class, people who've gone to Harvard and Yale, lose a sense of service. I mean, think that the Bonhoeffer children and brother-in-laws and brothers particularly, they die in service for Berlin and for Germany. Our elites today, after consumer society, having spent a lot of time at Princeton and at Yale, what you will hear from those professors is that they worry about this generation, that this generation doesn't have a kind of sense of service. They have a sense of becoming a hedge fund manager in New York City. They have a sense like that, but they have a sense of how you play the rules to get into the school, but a sense of service isn't there. So there is a kind of crisis of what happens when the elites fail to have a view of service, and then the other side demonizes the elites. Then how does a society actually move? And the Bonhoeffers in the early 20th century were elites, but they had a deep sense that being an elite meant that you had a responsibility to serve the larger good, to such an extent that Rudiger Schleicher, Hans von Dahani, Hans Bonhoeffer, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer would die. And Dietrich would die not as a Christian martyr. I mean, this is an open question. Was Dietrich Bonhoeffer a Christian martyr? There is in Israel, there is a monument to the faithful Gentiles. And every year there can be nominations for faithful Gentiles to be taken in. Multiple times Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been nominated as a faithful Gentile, and his application has been denied multiple times, because the response is he really wasn't a martyr for the sake of his religion or for others. He was a political casualty. And in some sense, I think Dietrich would feel fine with that, because he didn't enter into this action to have notoriety or to be a saint. He just tried to be faithful to what Jesus Christ was calling him to. So long story longer, John, is that no, I don't think Hitler ever knew the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Thank you, Andrew.
It's really good. I think we're about at time.
There was a question in the chat wondering if the Nazis burned or destroyed any of Bonhoeffer's writings that we might know of.
Yeah, that's a great question. He was banned from writing, but he continued to write. He at the book burning that happened at the university, none of Bonhoeffer's books were in that, though Einstein's books were in it and others. We actually have most of all of Dietrich's stuff at the State Library in Berlin. We again need to thank Eberhard Bethge. Bethge saved all of that stuff. Other letters he ran down and kept, and he had it all. As a matter of fact, I'll make a kind of pitch for you. Every other year or so, I teach a class in Berlin at the Bonhoeffer family house. The Bonhoeffer family house that Dietrich was arrested at is still intact. His room on the top floor is still there. You can go sit on his bed and sit in his desk. It was given to the church, and the church has held on to it. One of the living rooms has been made into a lecture hall, and everything else has been kind of left as it is. And then we always go, when I teach this class, to the State Library, and the State Library has all of his materials, sermons, original manuscripts, and I have a relationship with the librarian there, and we sit in a room and he brings out some of Dietrich's original materials and letters. So we have most of everything. So none of his stuff was burned. But again, we would know almost nothing about Dietrich Bonhoeffer unless you were German and you kind of were an obscure German theologian. You maybe read a couple things. We know nothing about Bonhoeffer without Eberhard Bethge. And Bethge died in 98 is when he died, around 98, 99. So we have to be very thankful for him. And Bethge married Dietrich's oldest sister's daughter. So you can see how the family was all kind of connected in this way. And Dietrich's older brother, Friedrich, had married Hans von Dahani's sister. Remember, Hans married Dietrich's second sister. So it was, again, these were kind of Berlin elites. They were all interconnected and their families were connected and they'd have parties with each other. And so we have to remember Dietrich. It's easy to remember Dietrich as this great saint, but we also have to think of him as someone of privilege. And, that's back to the elites. We're in a culture right now where we're rating against privilege, and we should, because privilege has been misused. But it is a big question for us of, can we really be a society where there is no privilege and what happens there? And kind of being opposed to privilege or leading people to be recognizing privilege. Also, we have to be safeguarding from it leading us to resent people. and leading us to actually demonize people and put them on each side. And so Bonhoeffer raises some really big questions for us.
And what to do with that privilege if
absolutely
you have it, which is what I think Bonhoeffer really does give us some good ideas there too. That's
right.
Good.
So it is a question of does privilege mean more of a demand on you for service, or are we looking for a society where there's no such thing as privilege? Right. And that's a big question for our society to think about. You have to be aware of it. So the kind of cultural reckoning we're doing now of being aware of privilege is really important. But the question is, does that mean we want to destroy all privilege? Or does that mean that we want to get back to a sort of formation where we ask people who have privilege to be aware of it and know that they have to be responsible for it in some way? Mm-hmm. And I think we can look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer as an incredibly privileged young man. He once said, I only want to have enough money that I don't have to count it. Now, think of that statement. That is the utter statement of privilege. I just want to have enough money that I never need to count it. That's what he said to Betka once. So he's an utter, child of privilege. But what I think we really do need to be thankful for is he used his privilege for others and was willing to sacrifice for others in the midst of that. And he never asked his students to do anything that he did. In the sense that he knew that he had more privilege, more awareness of what was going on, and that he would enter into this conspiracy. But one of his students, who was a working class person just trying to become a pastor, he didn't expect that they would give up and serve and maybe give up their life like he did. So Dietrich was very aware of his own cultural location that way.
Mm-hmm. It's really good.
Wow. Thank you so much, Andy. This has been fabulous. I am sure that we have plenty more questions.
We got another semester in Germany together soon enough.
There you go. If you want me if you all want to go to Berlin, I would be happy to take you to Berlin and we can do 4 days of doing it.
I definitely do.
Oh,
I got a sermon to preach on for confirmation now as well, which is awesome. I'm excited.
There you go.
You just took care of my prep for that. The other piece I really want to spend more time on down the road is the Sabine, the twinning and the vicarious representative action piece of having a twin. You've really piqued a lot of different lines of thought for I think all of us. So really appreciate your time. And
Thank you.
Yes,
look forward to having you again, maybe in the flesh, which would be
I would
awesome.
love to be in the flesh.
Yes, that would be
great.
Awesome.
Thank you all.
I was going to say, we'll have to ask this crowd, what do they want to study next about Bonhoeffer?
Send them in.
Thank you all so much for coming.
All right. Have a
good
wonderful
week.
day.
Thank you so much again, Andy.
Bye now.